Welcome to the deep dive. Today we're diving into the world of a storyteller.
I was going to say, you weren't kidding about deep dive, were you?
Haha, never. But really, this one's special. We're getting to know Lyat Portal. She calls herself an architect, but not in the way you might think.
Oh, I've taken a look at her work. Fascinating structures, but built with words, not bricks and mortar. And her Substack newsletter, The Lyat Show. My Journey to Infinity, a story unfolding across timelines. What a title.
Right, it's this whole mix of personal stories, Israeli culture, history, even architecture does make an appearance, which is where your expertise comes in. But first, who is Lyat Portal? How'd you describe her, just from what you've seen?
She's tough to pin down, which is exciting, calls herself an architect, which in a way she is. But instead of like blueprints, she's building these intricate narratives, weaving together music, food, entrepreneurship, you name it.
A master weaver of words, then. I
Yeah.
like it.
And this talent, it's not accidental. She often refers to herself as, quote, the daughter of the greatest storyteller. Her father, Nissim, who she actually brings into her work a lot.
Okay, hold on. We've got to circle back to dear old dad later. But before we get lost in family trees, what's the Lyat show like, format-wise?
Imagine having a long, fascinating chat with a brilliant friend who's also like a phenomenal storyteller.
Already sounds amazing.
It really is. Super conversational, often structured as dialogues, especially with her father, which just adds this whole other layer to it.
Oh, I am here for some intellectual family banter.
You and me both. And instead of one-off essays, she'll explore topics in these multi-part series released over several days, like binge-worthy intellectualism.
Okay, now you're speaking my language. Netflix, but for your brain.
Exactly. And you know, one of these binge-worthy series you shared, Lyat and her dad go deep on the history of housing, in Israel specifically. That's where architecture really takes center stage.
Yeah, that caught my eye too. Not every day someone connects personal stories with, like, the literal evolution of buildings. So break it down for us. What's the big takeaway there?
Well, there's this episode where they unpack the influence of the international style. Imagine, like, Bauhaus, but applied to entire buildings and neighborhoods. Clean lines, function over ornamentation, all about simplicity, efficiency. Huge in the 20s and 30s.
Okay, Bauhaus I'm vaguely familiar with. But for those of us who haven't exactly studied architecture, why was this so groundbreaking? What's the big deal about clean lines and being, functional?
It was revolutionary at the time. This was post-World War I, remember? Huge social and political upheaval. People wanted a break from the ornate, extravagant styles of the past. This was practical, egalitarian.
So not just aesthetics, but reflecting a whole shift in how people thought about design ADD society.
Exactly. And what makes it relevant to Liat's story is how this played out in Israel. They were dealing with a huge influx of immigrants needing housing, and fast.
So this international style, all about simple, efficient design, must have seemed like the perfect solution, right?
Exactly. And that's where it gets really fascinating. Liat and her father, they explore this tension between those carefully designed projects from the 30s, like Kiryat Meir in Tel Aviv, and those mass public housing projects that came later on. See, that's where you get this really interesting clash.
Right, because you can't talk about mass housing in Israel, especially back then, without getting into, like, the politics and social realities of the time.
Absolutely. And that's where Liat's storytelling just shines. You know, she
Mm.
brings those big historical things down to like real people's lives. Like she talks about her grandparents, they were immigrants, lived in one of those early housing projects.
Ah,
Yeah, coming from different backgrounds, thrown together in this totally new environment, shaped by these modernist ideals.
it's like those buildings become characters in her family history at that point.
Right. It makes you think about how these architectural choices, you might think they're just aesthetic, but they have these ripple effects on people's lives, generations down the line. And Leah doesn't shy away from the complicated stuff either.
Because it wasn't all, like, sunshine and roses, right? I mean, those later housing projects, weren't they built pretty quickly on a budget? I feel like they get a bad rap for being a little soulless.
Yeah, you're not wrong. And Leah tackles that head on, talks about how those design choices, even made with the best intentions, they didn't always work out in terms of creating these really thriving communities.
It's easy to forget that when you're just looking at, like, a blueprint or a facade.
For sure. But Lilia weaves it all together, personal reflections, these bigger historical and architectural trends. It's fascinating stuff.
This whole, like, architectural storytelling, it's really something else. It makes you realize buildings aren't just static things. They're part of this living, breathing, evolving story, you know?
Right. And for those ready to dive into Liet's world themselves, it's all there on her Substack newsletter, The Liet Show, My Journey to Infinity.
Yes. And speaking of Substack, can we just do a quick explainer for those who might not be in the know? What is Substack exactly?
Sure, imagine like a digital magazine rack. But for writers, they share their work directly with readers there.
Like cutting out the middleman.
Exactly. They might offer free subscriptions or paid ones with extra goodies. It gives writers more control, a way to really connect with their audience more personally.
So kind of the Wild West of publishing, in a good way.
That's a great way to put it. For someone like Liet, who blends genres, doesn't fit neatly into a box, it's perfect, lets her experiment, be vulnerable, really go deep on what she's passionate about.
And I've got to say, just from what we've discussed today, that passion is contagious. What I love about Leah's work, it's not just about one thing. It's not just architecture or history or even just storytelling.
Right, it's all about the connections, right?
Exactly. And those connections, they're not always obvious. Like, who would think the design of a building could give you insights into what it was like to be an immigrant or how a whole city evolved?
And she just does it all in such a captivating way. Honestly, I can almost picture her like sitting across from me at a cafe, sketching these ideas out on a napkin.
I know, right? And it's not all like theoretical musings either. She gets into the nitty-gritty with her dad, like the tough stuff about urban planning, preserving cultural heritage when the world's moving so fast.
It's really engaging.
And it makes you realize we need storytellers like this. She's not just throwing information at you. She makes you think critically about the spaces we live in, the stories we tell ourselves, and how those two things.
They're totally intertwined, aren't they?
Exactly. And that's something I think about a lot, walking around my own city. Like, what stories do the buildings here tell? What would Liat see?
That's such a great question, and it's one that her work just constantly makes you ask. To me, that's what makes storytelling impactful, when it stays with you after you're done reading.
Absolutely. It makes you curious, it challenges you, and it definitely leaves you wanting more. So for anyone listening who's like completely intrigued by Leia Portal now, where can they find her? Where's all this goodness?
Head straight to Substack, that's where it's at. Search for The Liet Show, My Journey to Infinity. You can find it on their website or app. Honestly, you won't regret it.
Like a perfectly spiced Bereka, huh? Full of unexpected flavors that'll leave you wanting more. Well, on that note, we've reached the end of our deep dive for today. Until next time, keep those thinking caps on and those curiosity fires burning.